Hi, this is Nico, and this is my project for computational neuroscience. My midterm reading was Metaphors We Live by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. I chose this book because I've always been inclined to learn about the structured languages we use and what this structure implies about our cognitive configuration. Possible common origins between linguistics and other domains of knowledge might be related to our understanding about varying types of neural computation and comprehension. This book was written from a linguistic philosophy viewpoint. This viewpoint attempts to solve philosophical issues by understanding the language we presently use. This book does so by presenting socially prevalent metaphors and deconstructing their figurative meanings. A little bit about the authors. George Lakoff is a cognitive linguist who conducted part of his studies at Indiana University and MIT, and later went on to teach seminars about metaphors at UC Berkeley. His thesis focused on how human understanding is heavily influenced by central metaphors used to explain natural phenomena. Mark Johnson is also a cognitive linguist and philosopher who conducted part of his studies at University of Chicago. The reason why this book in the emerging field of computational linguistics is of special interest to neuroscience is given our recent discussion on the structure of language. We see that language, along with mathematics, logic, and other cognitive functions, is inherently computational in nature and seemingly has served as a basis for human understanding since the dawn of time. The language and metaphors we use may also go unnoticed, but carry huge implications about the way we perceive types of neural computations since we use many metaphors to talk about the brain, saying phrases such as neurons get excited, they transmit information, and neurons that fire together wire together are just a few examples. So some of the questions I believe are important to answer are, what is the purpose of metaphors? How are metaphors created to reflect our understanding of our current surroundings? Do metaphors change with time? Do they vary across culture? What is truth? Is there such a thing as an absolute truth? And what is the relation between metaphors and society across time? So what are metaphors? What do we mean when we say time is money? Simply put, a metaphor is a linguistic expression used to compare two objects in an attempt to create some sort of connection. The most basic example takes the form A is B. Often, A will be a more abstract object or idea, while B is a better understood object with properties that humans can more easily visualize. Examples include time is money, argument is war, up in the air, and love is a journey. These may not always seem obvious while talking, but serve as our source of understanding. But then, how do we conceptualize non-physical objects and their meanings? And how do we use these meanings in everyday speech? This is best explained by the conduit metaphor. We use linguistic expressions as containers for meaning, and these meanings have an existence independent from one another. Imagine you have a container that represents the general idea of up, and each pen is a metaphor that utilizes this idea, but in different ways. One pen could represent it's up in the air, another could represent I'm on the fence, and so on. We see that up will generally refer to something that is unknown, and this might have some connection as to why superior religious entities or possible extraterrestrial life is generally believed to exist in the skies, far beyond our grounded and current understanding of alternative forms of life. Up is just one example of a container, part of a much larger set of containers we will come to term the conceptual system. So how does a conceptual system ascribe meaning to each object predefined in each container? How do we create a metaphor, assign it a meaning, and then use it in speech to be understood by others? The meaning of a metaphor is based on experiential gestalts, which are multidimensional structured wholes. These dimensions can sometimes be physical, like spatialization or one's visual field, or more symbolic dimensions, like referring to a king as the crown, symbolizing his status and power over others. In order to analyze how experience and metaphors are intertwined, we will look at three large subgroups of conventional metaphors: orientational, cultural, and ontological. These conventional metaphors are the greatest insight into how we create this conceptual system since they're the most used and well-known. In our orientational metaphors, our containers will be directional cues, such as front, back, up, down, on, off. We use these containers because these are more human characteristics that we take to be innate to us, and because we have more experience with them. We apply these every day to objects that do not innately have these orientations by saying something as trivial as, the book is on top of the desk, or you are standing in front of the door. Assigning objects that have directionality much like we do makes these metaphors much more relatable and easier to use, but this class of metaphors, like many others, also indirectly creates a hierarchy of containers. In this class, the container up will be viewed as having much higher priority than down container. This is the origin for phrases such as rise to the occasion, grow up, or just get over it. Our next class is cultural metaphors. Cultural metaphors reflect the values of those individuals. Containers within cultural metaphors can also vary greatly. At times, a culture may have a metaphorical container that simply does not exist in another. Asking someone what you do when life gives you lemons can vary greatly from culture to culture, even using the same metaphor. An example is the chemical metaphor. The chemical metaphor, greatly used in many Eastern cultures, views one's problem as a large vessel containing liquid. This liquid is constantly either precipitating or dissolving, but never completely vanishes. This indicates that one's problems are lifelong and always come back in different forms. Upon his arrival at UC Berkeley, an Iranian student took a seminar on metaphors by George Lakoff. Upon hearing the student's chemical metaphor, Lakoff came to the realization that cultural metaphors can give us new meanings to the same concepts. In Western culture, once a problem is over, we are not concerned with the issue anymore. This is not the case in Eastern culture, and this is reflected in their problem-solving skills. Our final class of metaphors is ontological. Ontological metaphors, more specifically personification, help us to understand our experiences in terms of objects and substances. By saying A is B, we impose artificial boundaries with objects that do not share our presumed inherent properties. We do this via the way of interactional metaphors. By making Mater and Lightning McQueen interact in a human fashion, we personify them, allowing us to see their interactions similar to ours, creating a veil that we perfectly relate to them, when in reality, this is intentional. The ontological metaphors give us a template for how to structure the unknown and the known, and this is the basis for every conceptual system. This brings us a bit closer to understanding the conceptual basis when we say, the brain is a computer. So what are the metaphorical implications? Firstly, this implies that we know more about the computer than the brain. This also implies that the brain can have on-off properties similar to the computer. We can derive phrases such as, they broke down, they are always on when it comes to their work, or today's just an off day. We can either talk about the brain as a strong, productive, resilient tool, known as a machine metaphor, or a tool, although built well, can break under the most delicate of circumstances, known as a brittle metaphor. We choose which metaphor and container to use to talk about the brain based on what we want to emphasize or hide about the brain. So the answer to, is the brain a computer, will depend on what aspect of the brain you want to focus on, whether it be its ability to recognize faces, learn to ride a bike, or solve a biophysics homework problem, because this will determine which container you use, which carries implications about its relation to the larger subclass of containers, as we saw with our orientational metaphors. These three subclasses are just a couple of dimensions that go into our experiences, but our comprehension of the world around us consists of infinitely more dimensions and infinitely more containers that comprise our experiential gestalts, and these gestalts help us to ascribe meaning to these metaphors. So far, we have seen that our understanding of the world can vary based on which metaphors we use and how we experience them. But is there a metaphor that describes an absolute principle, unchanged across culture and time? Does such a thing exist? The search for truth has always had two main competitors, the objectivist and the subjectivist. The purpose of this book was to offer a third option, the experiential synthesis, who use metaphors to comprehend partially what cannot be understood completely. Objectivists hold that there are absolute facts independent of people and time, that objects in our worlds have predetermined inherent properties, and that we gain knowledge through experiencing these objects, such as, we know a rock is rough and hard by feeling the surface and throwing it against a wall. This view fails to recognize that language does not give these objects inherent properties, rather interactional. A rock has no inherent front, back, up, down orientations, nonetheless it is valid to say, that rock in front of the trees is upside down. On the other hand, subjectivists hold that truth is dependent on our senses and our developed intuitions, that truth transcends rationality and objectivity, and that metaphorical language is necessary for expression of unique and personal aspects of experiences. Although more appealing, just like objectivists, subjectivists miss that the way we understand the world is through interactions with it. While they deem language imperative, our imaginative understanding is given in terms of a conceptual system that is grounded in our functioning within physical and cultural environments, not mere intuition and feelings. So what about those who believe in experiential synthesis? Our understanding and experiences are based on thousands of dimensions of life, and some dimensions can vary across culture and time. So do we believe in absolute truths? The short answer is no. Linguistic philosophy believes that truth is relative to its conceptual system, and the conceptual system is relative to some particular frame of reference, such as language or culture. This is known as cultural relativism. But why do we care if there is an absolute truth at all? We care about truth because even if it doesn't exist, it plays a role in daily functioning and gives us a sense of order and some sort of binary right-wrong system in the way we act towards others, in the life decisions we take, even in how we dress and what we eat. Other abstract concepts such as religion and social norms have very similar roles in society. We restrict ourselves with abstract concepts to avoid arguments fueled by concrete examples, and then support our choices by saying, because it's just right. So, why does neuroscience care about this? What's so relevant about the way we speak? Experiences, metaphors, language, and understanding, they are all fundamentally cognitive functions. And although we know more about how these factors develop over the course of one's life, it is less known if these are innate circuitries or if we acquire them somehow. Some aspects of language are universal, such as nouns, verbs, and adjectives, but even our understanding of these fundamental units of language can vary by culture. So it is in the interest of neuroscience to try to uncover if language acquisition and understanding are hardwired. Noam Chomsky, a famous American linguist, provided his theory of the language acquisition device, which would account for the rapid speed at which children seem to learn language and its rules. Although this later developed into the theory of universal grammar, which states that a set of structural rules are innate to humans, independent of sensory experience, his initial theory positioned the idea that children are born with a circuitry to learn language and had an innate ability to categorize parts of speech as noun, verbs, adjectives, and so on. Metaphors exist in every domain of knowledge. Children learn about binary operators in math in terms of objects they've seen before. Sally bought 45 watermelons, gives 10 to Charlie. How many does she have left? We exhaust our understanding of metaphors through literature by diving into symbolic dimensions of meaning and by personification. The walls have ears. Metaphors are also used as weapons. Politicians will often use their power to push for their metaphors, and this is how metaphors can become symbolized as an absolute truth within a culture, passed down from generation to generation. But those of high status are not the only ones with the ability to create and support their metaphors for their own agendas. Society is also able to come together and use metaphors as a vehicle for empowerment and cultural change. Rosie the Riveter was a metaphor resulting from a change in times, aka World War II, which initiated changes in our cultural, gendered, and political dimensions, and this is reflected in the way we represent and speak about important women today. In synthesis, metaphors reveal that we are driven to organize our society and our personal beliefs in a way that is consistent with the way we speak. These beliefs can vary greatly across culture and time, but this nonetheless gives us a sense of truth, order, and solidarity. Outside of the human dimension, we are driven to organize our surroundings based on human-relevant conceptual systems. And any property we ascribe to non-human objects, such as the lamp jumped onto the letter, is by way of a conceptual dimension we are familiar with. These properties are more likely to be a result of how we want these objects to interact with the world, not because we believe these objects have any sort of analogously inherent properties. So next time you speak figuratively, whether at a conference, meeting, or even in an email, you now have enough background to analyze these metaphors more critically, being able to come up with possible reasons why they are structured and understood in such way. Thank you for listening to my project.